World War One was a political clothes washer. Constitutional monarchies collapsed left, right and centre. Ethnic and regional tensions boiled over. Books about the complex situation are measured in hundreds of pages and volumes. Still, we're about to confine ourselves to but a small forgotten sphere of the conflict, one we need to remind ourselves cost the lives of 20 million. This was one front in which the New Zealand government wasn't initially told about, till Allied troops were literally landing on the shores, 4 of those being New Zealanders. What I'm talking about is the Northern Russian intervention, and the subsequent relief mission to rescue the Allied troops on the ground in Russia, which also involved more New Zealanders. That took place after the guns had stopped firing in France and Belgium. For all this to make sense, let's take a look at the bigger picture. The Bolshevik takeover in Russia in October 1917 didn't end the Civil War, not by a long shot. That took to the end of 1922 and would cost 10 million lives, mostly through starvation. The blood had hardly dried on the Bolshevik Revolution when Lenin signed a peace treaty with Germany, and it was all quiet on the Eastern Front. Germany was no longer fighting on 2 fronts and could redirect its vast resources towards the Allies. This was a disaster for the Allies, who had been supporting the Imperial Russian campaign not just with armaments but with loans. Loans the new Bolshevik government said weren't their problem anymore. The British and Americans were particularly livid at this development. Moreover, they also saw the global threat posed by communism. This was the Afghanistan of its day. The Allies would intercede in the Civil War and bolster the forces still fighting the Red government. A loose grouping of monarchists, regional ethnic groups wanting independence, and liberals who hated the prospect of giving their property to the state, united under the guise of the White Army. They also had another reason to go to the 2 places they did. Archangel, which is pronounced something like Archangel in Russian, and Murmansk. There were 2 massive stockpiles of Allied armaments stored in these port cities for their former allies. Right next door was Finland, and they had also fought a recent civil war, with the Bolsheviks on the side of the Reds, surprise surprise, and the slightly more democratic side, the Whites, supported in no small way by the Germans. The Whites won. The Allies now expected the Germans to cash in their chips. They were now within striking distance of a huge armament stockpile. Only in truth the Germans' petrol tank was now almost on empty. Allied intelligence instead predicted the opposite, that troops could suddenly find themselves looking down the barrel of a British-made gun and being bombarded by a shell made in the United States. As the war raged on in the European trenches, 15,000 Allied troops were divided between Archangel and Murmansk. The first detachment reached Murmansk in the middle of June 1918. Their tasks: to help defeat the Russian army and stop a possible German invasion out of Finland, and build a defensive perimeter around the ports against both adversaries. The multinational force involved in the Northern Russian intervention had troops from a large range of countries: British, who the New Zealanders fought under, United States, Poles, Czechs, Serbs, Australian, Canadians, Italians are just some. There were 4 New Zealanders who landed at Archangel on the 2nd of August 1918 under the command of British Major General Pole's detachment of 1,500 men. They were all active soldiers, being previously with the New Zealand Expeditionary Forces and granted temporary commissions with the British Army. All 4 were sergeants. Pictures have been hard to get on this one. Now I'm living in my COVID jail with mildly better food than the real one. I wasn't able to undertake my normal research at the Christchurch Library. Perry and McLean were part of the 2nd Battalion Canterbury Infantry Regiment, a random group of which are pictured. Their battalion had been heavily involved on the Western Front, the Somme and Passchendaele, to mention two of the more notable engagement. Macready was with the 1st Battalion Auckland Infantry. That's them marching over Grafton Bridge before departing to the front. He served in the same battles as the Cantabrians. Burke was from down south, and he served with the 2nd Battalion Otago Infantry, who fought from Gallipoli right through to taking on the secret mission. To the small list, you could possibly also include Bernard Russell French. French I found a photo of. He was born in Christchurch, moved to Sydney when he was young, and spent the rest of his life in England. Serves with distinction with the Royal Munster Fusiliers. Now back to the overview. The whole operation was hush-hush to start with. The Kiwis and their comrades were not even aware of their destination until they were off the coast of Norway. The only thing that went right for the interventionist forces were the landings. The White Russians had taken the two cities and welcomed their support. After that small bit of initial success, it was now a steady downhill for the next 14 months thereafter. The expedition was flawed on many levels. The Russian population was starving, and resources were going to feed the local populace as well as the captured Red troops, which are pictured, as if the supply issues weren't already an issue. As a military force, the Russian White Armies was a shambles with questionable allegiances. Then you had a hodgepodge of Allied troops under different commanders. Next, the weather. Oh, the weather. You are talking the Arctic Circle here. For 6 weeks a year in winter, Archangel and Murmansk don't see the sun. This is the port of Murmansk in winter, in the afternoon. It was taking such a toll on the troops, it necessitated the British to bring in Ernest Shackleton as an advisor. Then we get to the vexed issue of a morale perspective for the Allies. Remind us what we're putting ourselves in harm's way for. Thankfully, Monty Python can adequately sum the situation up for us.
That it was presented to us by the Corporation of the Town of Sudbury to commemorate Empire Day, when we try to remember the names of all those from the Sudbury area who so gallantly gave their lives to keep China British.
Much like the Taliban, the Russian army instead were fighting for a cause, 1 million of which were proceeding north to pick off the pockets of resistance. Then, if all of that wasn't already bad enough, on the 11th of November, the guns went silent on the Western Front. The only Germans left fighting were in the Baltic states, who didn't consider the surrender applied to them. They were in a hell of a pickle, with Russia now right on their doorstep. They feared getting slaughtered and preferred to fight on. The Allied troops in Russia were stuck in a dubious political conflict, whilst their mates were sailing off to reunite with their loved ones. Nor could they look for support from a war-weary public back home. They didn't want a bar of the Russian intervention. The only ones half keen to keep involved were the United States. Britain decided in March 1919 to get the hell out. The Army and Navy had to ask for volunteers to form a rescue force before the massive Red Army overran troops pinned in their salients. Join what was called the Northern Russian Relief Force, adverts for which appeared in New Zealand newspapers. It was clearly a hard sell. A night down at the pub with your mates, shagging the wife after a good home-cooked meal, or having a limb blown off in 15 degrees below in a hellhole you reached after being seasick for 2 months. The prime candidates were those that had arrived in England to find the war was over and weren't traumatised. Still, somehow they cobbled together a relief force of 8,000 volunteers, in which there were 2 Kiwis. That force was immediately involved in an attack on Bolshevik troops, a delaying tactic to allow the withdrawal. On the very same day, the relief force were out attacking the Red Army. They also had the messy bit explaining to the White Army commanders, the citizens of the cities of Archangel and Murmansk, that they were off as soon as they briefly subdued the Red Army. Mild panic took place. All they could do to temper the news was to promise the remaining stores, guns and ammo were all yours, well, at least until the Red Army marched into town, which they did about 6 weeks after the relief force sailed over the horizon. Thanks for all the salted fish and cheap vodka and women. Speaking of which, rampant pox and drunken disobedience had become an issue amongst the troops from the original expeditionary forces. The White Russians were deserting in hordes, most of which had had a guts full of the fighting and just simply marched off back home. And Sergeant McLean was one that got caught with a serious dose of the clap, which took him out of the hostilities. When the itinerant labourers from China, brought in to get things done behind the scenes, found out they weren't on the passenger list to make it out, they rioted and added to the looting issue. So, we'll need to add these two to the list to make 6 New Zealanders who can rightfully claim to have invaded Russia. The last 2 I have photos for. Pilot Gordon Pettigrew on the left from North Auckland. He claimed in his 70s that he was press-ganged into serving in Russia as punishment for a joy ride over Brighton Beach he made on Armistice Day. The last one is the most famous. Frank Arthur Worsley from Akaroa. Here's a clue as to Worsley's fame. Yep, captain of the Endurance on Shackleton's ill-fated Antarctic expedition and in the longboat to South Georgia. I will do a video on him at some later stage. His bravery as part of the Royal Navy captaining the supremely British-sounding vessel, the Cricket, up in Russia, won him an award to add to his numerous list. There was also a possible 7th come 8th Kiwi who has invasion credentials. A character, Private Thomas Peter Smith. Don't have a photo for him either. Thomas Smith, as he was then called, was born in Waimate. Smith had been in the Boer War and, having had a taste for war, signed up for the New Zealand Expeditionary Forces the first chance he got. Only when he got to Egypt, for some unbeknownst reason, he changed his birth date, began using the name Peter Smith, and jumped ship to the Australian forces. The colourful Smith was a gallant soldier, winning awards left, right and centre, as well as a disciplinary record that saw him abusing superiors, possessing an ever-present casual regard to authority, as well as spending a month in hospital after catching the clap. All of this whilst with the Aussies. Smith signed up for the relief force that went to Archangel. The evacuation of that city took place on the 28th of September in Murmansk on the 12th of October 1919. On board the rescue vessels were 8,000 civilians, including the Chinese labourers and women the troops had taken a shine to. Let's ask ourselves, what did it all achieve? The British losses were put at 526, and I couldn't readily obtain a breakdown as to their fates. The United States gave a better, more telling account of their casualties. 83 killed in battle, and 84 of cold, disease and accidents. Read what you like into the disease category. Spare a thought for the 75 or so captured troops. They were carted off to Moscow and put in the general prison population before being freed 12 months later in a prisoner exchange. There you have it, like the Imperial Camel Courts video I covered previously. It's a fascinating and forgotten story. Just a pity there are so few photos of the campaign, and I couldn't get to the Lorrby to have a rat around. Big thanks to those who support my labour of love. Professor Trapeznik at the Otago University for his notes. And don't forget, unlike the whores of Russia and Egypt, which Sergeant McLean and Private Smith encountered, it's free here to subscribe. So go ahead, have a crack. Bye for now.